Right, so welcome to our workshop today on identifying research threshold concepts. I'm really excited to see so many people here today. I know we have folks from Ohio State, we have folks from other universities, we have instructors, we have librarians, probably some graduate students as well. So I think that will make a great mix, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion and everyone will leave with a better idea of threshold concepts and how they relate to thinking about teaching research and teaching information literacy. So my name is Jane Hammonds. I am the Teaching and Learning Engagement Librarian and an assistant professor in the university libraries. You can email me at hammonds.73, and I'm always happy to talk more about any of these topics. So please go ahead and send me an email if you do have any questions or comments. So what we're going to be doing today, we're going to explore a little bit the concept of threshold concepts. Then we're going to think about threshold concepts in relationship to research and information literacy, and then think about how we can support students' ability to cross threshold concepts. So I'd like to know, before we really jump into the content, how familiar folks are with the concept of threshold concepts. I know for some folks this might be completely new, some might be more familiar. So I'm going to go ahead and do a poll really quickly just to get an idea of familiarity with threshold concepts. So hopefully everyone should now be seeing that poll. So if you feel comfortable responding, please go ahead and post that in the chat. Give everyone a few seconds to respond. So give it 10 more seconds in case anyone else would like to respond. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. 3, 2, 1. And I will share those results there. So hopefully everyone can see the poll results. So we have a few folks that are very familiar with threshold concepts. It looks like the majority of folks, though, are not really familiar with threshold concepts or only slightly familiar with threshold concepts. So that's great. Both audiences are great. Hopefully those folks that are really familiar with threshold concepts, if if I struggle to explain anything or you have additional comments to add, that would be helpful. Please feel free to share those. And hopefully those folks that are not really as familiar with threshold concepts will leave today with a better understanding of what they are and how they relate to research. Go ahead and stop sharing, close that poll. Completely new, Thomas says, great. All right, so threshold concepts. To get us started with this, I'm going to share several different definitions, and this might seem a little bit like definition overload, but this is one of those concepts that it can take a little bit of time to get, and different definitions provide different aspects that somehow kind of come together to help me understand this concept myself. So some of these, as you're looking at these, may be more relevant to you than others, maybe more helpful to you than others. And so that's really why I'm going to share several different definitions, thinking about how different people have defined this concept. One just may be the one that is the one that sort of helps you understand this concept. So we'll start out at a kind of very basic level with a couple of descriptions of threshold concepts. So you can see that these definitions, they both have connection this idea that a threshold concept is a concept that when you understand that concept, when you finally grasp it, it changes the way you think about a topic or changes the way you understand a subject, right? So it has that transformational aspect. Once I get this, then I start to see things in a different way, right? So those are some sort of basic level definitions of threshold concept. So threshold concepts are really originally developed out of some of the work of Mayer and Land. And so this is how they describe threshold concepts. They talked about this idea of a portal, right? So it's something that you pass through. And then once you've passed through that portal or once you've crossed that threshold, that's when it opens up that new way of thinking about something that previously there was some sort of block there. The door was closed, the portal was closed. You weren't able to think in that way. But then something happens, you grasp something, you understand certain things, and then you're able to sort of make that transition, pass through that portal, and now you're in a different area. You're in a different way of seeing and thinking about things. So this transformed way of understanding, without which it's not possible they are going to progress. So like within your particular discipline or major, there are certain concepts that you have to be able to grasp to be able to progress, right, within that discipline, within that field. All right, so this is continuation of that same quote. And so they talk about here, this may represent how people in a particular discipline, for example, how they think or how they perceive, right? And so you'll hear threshold concepts. A lot of times you'll hear the phrase ways of thinking and ways of practicing, right? So these are those concepts that you need to get to grasp to move from studying physics to thinking like a physicist and acting like a physicist, right? So what are those key core concepts that you really have to get to be able to make that transition? And once you've grasped those concepts, now you perceive the world the way that a physicist perceives the world, right? So ways of thinking, ways of knowing, I think that's a great way to, great phrase to keep in mind as we think about what we're talking about with threshold concepts. So again, another sort of definition from Mayer and Land is portals, conceptual gateways. That these were like these troublesome areas, these places where students may have gotten stuck or blocked. But then once something happens, they're able to unlock that door and move across that threshold. And now this new way of, this transformed way of thinking develops. This definition talks about threshold concepts specifically is that, those core knowledge and those disciplinary capabilities that students have to know to transition or to progress. I like this part of the definition in that, there's really, how we determine what threshold concepts are within a particular discipline are the folks in that discipline are the ones that are able to name those. Right. So they're the ones that are able to identify, here are the key things, the key ways of thinking that students need to get to be able to move beyond, right, and to transform into thinking like we do, thinking like an expert in the field. Right. And then I really wanted to highlight this one. I think this is the last definition. I really like the aspect of this definition is that these are so ingrained that they often go unspoken or unrecognized by practitioners. So once you cross the threshold, once you pass through the portal, it becomes very difficult to see things the way you did when you were a novice learner, right? Certain things just become natural to you. They become ingrained, they become tacit. And so we may not always specifically talk about these things with our students because we don't recognize them in ourselves, right? It's just become natural. This is how I view the world. And so I may not be able to see what it is that is actually causing students to not get it, right? Because I've made that transition. Right. So those are a bunch of different definitions of threshold concepts. And if there are any of those that really resonate with you, or any of those that are not clear, I'd love to hear about that. How to deal with the ever-changing. That's a great question, Kate. And so that gets to this point that what we think about as being a threshold concept within a particular discipline may not be stable, right? And that aligns with, I think, just the practice of scholarship in general, that things are always going to be changing. So we can identify at this point, here are what we think the threshold concepts are, but those may not stay the same as the field progresses, right? Absolutely. Yeah, kind of like motor memory, right? Here are the things that we do without even thinking about them because we've just become so used to them. Right. All right, so Mayer and Land highlighted several different characteristics of threshold concepts. So we've already talked a little bit about this transformative nature, right? So these are not just like new things that a student learns within a discipline or a field, right? Oh, I didn't know that before. But this is something that once you learn it, it really changes the way that you think about this discipline or the way that you approach this discipline. And as it talks about here, it can lead to a shift in personal identity, right? I now feel like I am a chemist. I feel like I am a historian, right? And so it makes that actual, a major transition, not just, oh, here's something new that I learned, right? And as we already talked about, again, this idea of irreversible, that once you've passed through the portal, it's hard to go back. It's unlikely that you're gonna go back to the way that you saw things before, right? You're not gonna forget, because because it's so transformative, right? It's likely going to be irreversible. Right, integrated. So it exposes the previously hidden interconnectedness of things or interrelatedness of things. So this is when, students start to really see the big picture of the field or the discipline, right? They see things connected in a way that they didn't before. So they understand, oh, now that's why that's why that happens, because it's connected to this over here, right? So it makes those connections that previously were hidden to students now come together, right? Bounded. So it may help sort of define the boundaries of a particular discipline, maybe unique to a discipline. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, thinking about research or information literacy related threshold concepts. And then the last thing, that these are troublesome, right? So these are places where students get stuck, where they struggle. They struggle to grasp these concepts because they may be very conceptually difficult, very foreign to their way, the way of thinking that students previously had. It may require student, maybe kind of counterintuitive in some ways, or maybe different than the sort of ordinary everyday way. For example, with the specialized language, there may be certain terms that have a specific meaning within a field that are different from the everyday use, and students have to grapple with that. So they're trouble, right? They're troublesome. They're places where students struggle, students get stuck, right? And so that portal can sometimes be closed for students. So it may take time to make that transition. The first time you're exposed to a concept, it may not, may not stick. It may take several times. We talk a lot about students being in a liminal space. So they're kind of in an in-between space before they're actually able to make that transition. Right. So these are a couple examples that Mayer and Land share about concepts that might qualify in particular fields as threshold concepts. And the challenge that I found, folks always ask, well, what are examples of threshold concepts? And I think the issue is that it's hard when you're outside of the discipline to even understand why that is a threshold concept in the discipline. So these are examples that Mayer and Land give, for example, and they name opportunity cost as a threshold concept when in economics. So that once students grasp this understanding of opportunity cost, that's going to change the way they approach studying and thinking about economics. The challenge is, right, as someone who is not an economist and who has only very limited understanding of opportunity cost, it's hard for me to see why that is a threshold concept or to describe why that is a threshold concept. So I did want to share these as examples. If folks out there have a really great explanation for thinking about each of these as threshold concepts, I would love to hear it. But I did want to share one more example from a field that I feel that I do have better understanding in, and I'm able to explain it. So before I became a librarian, I got a master's degree in history. I taught history classes for a couple years. And so a threshold concept in history is one that I feel that I can explain a little bit, right? And so this is this idea of thinking about history as not being this very straightforward and uniform narrative of what happened, right? So, a student might look at a history textbook and say, okay, this is what happened in history, right? History is about facts. It's about this list of facts, and studying history is about memorizing and regurgitating those historical facts, right? But someone who thinks like a historian recognizes that history is really multiple, often competing narratives, right? That there's not one unified narrative of history, right? Each history textbook is going to present a different, sometimes slightly different, sometimes majorly different narrative of what happened in history. And so history is all about interpretation, and it's all about argument. And so if we think about history assignments that students might have, students might push back if they haven't crossed this threshold, A student might not understand why they're being asked to make an argument or, provide an interpretation. They want a history, test that is a multiple choice list of facts that I can memorize. And when the instructor tries to move them beyond that, it can be real challenging, and students can resist that interpretation of history. Right. So that is, for me, sort of the threshold concept that is easiest for me to explain. But I would love to hear if other folks have ideas of other threshold concepts that they've encountered in their discipline. So we'll pause there for a second to let you all have a chance to ask any questions. I'd love to share your thoughts. For those of you that threshold concepts were something that was completely new, I'd love to hear what you think about this. If those of you that have thought about this a little bit in your discipline, if you have ideas of threshold concepts in your discipline, I'd like to hear those as well. Any questions that you have. So I'll pause here for a second to let folks add any questions that they have. You can share those in the chat. If you'd like to raise your hand and unmute, we could also do that as well. But we'll just pause here to see questions or thoughts that might come in. So Thomas asked a great question. How do students recognize and communicate that they are struggling with a threshold concept? And that's a really great question. And I don't really know if students would be able to make that recognition, right? So I think that in this case, it's more on the instructors for us to recognize when they might be coming up against a threshold concept. Because I think for a novice learner, you have to, my perspective would be that you would have to pass through the portal to even kind of recognize something like this as a, so they might be struggling, but they might not really be able to explain why, right? There's something that I'm not getting. And then something will happen, and then they'll be able to get it. So they might be able to describe the moment when they cross the threshold, but until that moment, they may not be able to recognize that they actually are struggling with one of these concepts, right? So I think that's one of the things that's our responsibility as instructors, is identifying those concepts, so that we can explicitly talk about those with students and help them across the threshold. Let's see. So I was taught this, but I imagine patient-centered care was a big change for older medical professionals. Yeah, that's a great example, Mercedes. And I saw very similar. So patient-centered care, I saw very similarly in education, student-centered learning, right, as a big change as well. So I think that those are sort of related and really good examples. Absolutely. Research is inquiry is a big one in the biological sciences, since students are used to one correct answer. Yeah. Research is inquiry, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that one later after a while. Rebecca shared in my discipline, Derrida, right? Deconstruction, yes. Butler, gender as a performative, yes. Deconstruction, yeah, definitely one I've heard mentioned as well. Within mythology, once you understand that there are multiple versions of stories that are contradictory at times, doesn't mean that one version is more correct or accurate than the other. They coexist with each other and are equally important. Yes, thank you for that, Rachel. Yeah, and that's very similar to thinking about with history. I did have a time when I tried to kind of talk about this with some freshman students, and it was really challenging for them to understand this idea that there wasn't one right version of history. And they immediately went to the idea that, okay, that means nothing matters, nothing is true, right? So it's really hard to reconcile this idea that there might be multiple sort of narratives or multiple versions that could all have value and could all coexist at the same time. Absolutely. Lorian shared, I think there's something similar to this in literature. There's no one correct interpretation of a text, right? Even if the author themselves has discussed what they meant. Yes. Thank you so much. Beth shared in geology, a threshold concept would be plate tectonics, right? Until you know and understand that as a bigger process, it's difficult to link everything that comes after. Yeah, thanks so much. Makes me wonder what are threshold concepts for librarians. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a sec, Kate. So threshold concepts for librarians: authority, methods of information organization. Yep. We have to identify what the threshold concepts are and be sure to explicitly teach them to students. Rebecca, questions? Right. So that's, we're going to talk a little bit about that, Rebecca, in terms of what are the benefits of kind of an approach to teaching that is centered around identifying and explaining threshold concepts to students and what the challenge might be for that one. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Kim shared intersectionality and issues of power and oppression as systems. Yes. Jua shared minimum language, limit threshold and language proficiency, right, to benefit from the language. So Thomas shared, I asked that question because I feel strong in that space now, but it's hard to articulate that you don't get it when you don't know what it is. Yes, absolutely, Thomas. You know that there's something you're not getting. You know things are not coming together right, but you don't know why. There's that one piece or that something that is missing that once it happens, then it's like, oh, now it comes all together. But you can be in that space a long time, and not everyone is always able to make that transition. Right. So students often hit a roadblock in their study because they don't get the threshold concepts. Are there things that we should be teaching? So that's where we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Absolutely. Great. So yeah, thank you so much for all of you for sharing those great examples of threshold concepts, those ideas. And we're going to talk more specifically about some threshold concepts related to research and information literacy. And thinking about where are the places when we think about research that students might struggle? What are the things that experienced researchers might know that constitute threshold concepts? And apologies if I missed anyone in the chat. We had a lot of comments coming in, and of course it starts to move around really quickly. So if I did miss your comment, I'm sorry, but I appreciate so much everyone sharing their ideas and thoughts there in the chat. So this is a quote that is shared in the Mayor and Land article that they provide an example of what it feels like sort of when someone crosses the threshold or when they realize this. So this is someone who's was in statistics and talking about viewing the world through a statistical lens, right? And they have the quote here, my own experience in discovering this was like a revelation, right? Akin to the experience I had when I put on my first pair of eyeglasses. Suddenly everything was sharp and clear, right? So that sort of constitutes what that feeling might be once you cross one of those thresholds. Suddenly things start to be clear. Suddenly things start to make sense in a way that they did not before. So I wanted to get an idea. So thinking about your experience with research, your experience as a researcher, your experience teaching research, your experience teaching information literacy, can you think of a putting on the eyeglasses moment in your own experience? Something, where something about the purpose or the process of research suddenly became very clear to you in a way that it did not before. So we're going to do this as a Jamboard. So I'll put the link in the chat one more time so that folks have access to those links. You can get that to paste. And I'll go ahead and go out to the Jamboard. Hopefully folks are able to access that. I know that a lot of folks have used the Jamboard by now. If you haven't used the Jamboard before, the easiest way to add a comment is to go over here on the left-hand side, click sticky note. You can type your comment in, you can change your color of your sticky note and go ahead and post those. But I would love to hear if folks are comfortable sharing what your eyeglasses moment might be. And I'll share an example while folks are thinking and talking, thinking and writing for myself. And it's perfectly okay if you've not had your eyeglasses moment. That is fine too. So one example I remember very clearly writing a paper as an undergraduate. We remember sitting in my bedroom and what my computer looked like, one of those big funky desktop computers. And I was writing away at this paper. And I finally realized as I was about halfway through that what I was arguing did not match what my sources said. And I had to make a choice at that point. Was it going to be, I'm actually going to change what I'm arguing to match what the sources say? Or am I going to go out and try to find new sources? And I made the decision, I'm going to change what I'm arguing because this is the way that scholars use sources. Right? They don't use sources just to back up what they already thought. They use sources to guide how they are thinking about a topic, right? So this was for me, right, a more scholarly way of thinking about research, that I'm going to let the sources guide where I go rather than trying to jam them into what I was already thinking, right? So for me, and I recognize and still remember that moment as a really big shift. So I'd love to hear, any ideas. And if you don't have one to share, it can be hard to think of these. That's okay as well. But we'll give folks a few more seconds. Just making some of these a little bit bigger so we can see. Um, Right. So some of the responses that folks are sharing, thank you so much for sharing these. So writing as thinking rather than documentation. Yeah, that's great. So research as conversation. And that also really aligns with this moving from research, a literature review paper that gives an overview of what others say to entering conversation with my own original thesis. Yes, right. So different view of what that purpose of a literature review is, that you're entering that conversation, right? Going into research assignment with an open mind, not an already created thesis. Yes, absolutely. Adjusting how I talk about different types of publications to be cognizant of changing times. Realizing what a research question actually is. Research is like a scientific method. I may have a hypothesis, but I can't go into it with thesis answer to my question already determined. So that's definitely seems like a theme that several folks have had there, this sort of opening up the perspective of research as this process of inquiry, and research is a process of conversation, and going into research with an open mind and not having the predetermined, this is what I'm going to find. Absolutely. Let's see. Emphasizing that the purpose of citation is to give credit. This can lead to a conversation about how much you can incorporate without plagiarism. Yes. Let's see. Oh, somehow managed to get really big there. Sure. Not sure how to really quickly get that one. And in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and move on. But again, thank you all so much for sharing your ideas there about those kind of eyeglass moments that you have had yourself. Great. So, and I think we saw, saw a lot of similarities in some of those responses as well. So we'll go ahead and go back to the presentation. Hopefully folks are seeing that again. If you're not seeing what you think you should be seeing, please do let me know. So I wanted to mention really quickly, when we think about this idea of threshold concepts in relation to research, or threshold concepts in relation to information literacy. There have been some folks that have argued that it doesn't really fit because, information literacy is not a discipline, or research is not a discipline. Those folks that are librarians out there will know likely that, there have been some discussions in the field about whether or not information literacy should be considered a discipline. We haven't, don't have time to get into that. But Townsend and her colleagues, who have done did a lot of the work in really introducing threshold concepts into the field of information literacy, they really argued that even if we don't consider information literacy a discipline, or research a discipline, there's still a common way of thinking and practicing that are shared by information professionals, whether that's librarians or information professionals more broadly, or I would argue maybe experienced researchers, that there's still this common way of thinking and practicing that are shared among this group of people that constitutes a body of knowledge, right? And that there were thresholds for experienced researchers or for information professionals. So we're going to talk a little bit about what some of these might be, but I did want to just acknowledge that there, some folks may say that threshold concept doesn't strictly fit if we don't think about information literacy as a discipline. But I still believe, and I agree with this quote, that I still think that there is this shared common way of thinking and common way of practicing that crosses many disciplines, maybe all disciplines, when it comes to research. There are certain things that experienced researchers know, understand, do often without thinking, that does constitute this kind of shared way of thinking and way of practicing. Right. Information literacy is a tool that can be used across disciplines. Yes. Mm-hmm. All right. So as we think about identifying research threshold concepts, here are some of the questions that we can ask ourselves. Right. So what are the things that experienced researchers understand? about information, about how information is created, how it's accessed, how it's shared, how it's valued, about scholarship, about how scholarship works, about research, the purpose and process of research. What are those things that experienced researchers understand, know, do, but which novice researchers do not, and which could create a bottleneck or a roadblock for students because there's something that they're not getting, that we do, that we understand, maybe without even knowing that we do, and that influences our expectations. So, what are those unifying concepts that once fully understand would change the way students approach research, change what they do as a researcher, right? So these are some of the questions to think about. So those folks out there that are librarians will know that a few years ago, the Association of College and Research Libraries published the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, which was a very new approach and way of thinking about information literacy that was very heavily influenced by threshold concept theory. So instead of putting out a list of skills that students need to learn, what the framework tried to do is highlight what those core concepts are. What are the core threshold concepts related to research, related to information that students really need to get or to understand to be able to navigate the information environment that we live in, to be able to be effective as scholars and researchers. So I'm going to go through and highlight these 6 core concepts really quickly. I know some of you will be familiar with them, some of you will not. So they're okay. I just want to highlight them really quickly. Experienced DMPs know what a PCOT question is and how it guides the research. Yes, thank you. Right, so really quickly, these 6 core information literacy concepts. The first is authority is constructed and contextual. So this is understanding that there are many different information sources out there. Those sources have different levels of authority. There are multiple factors that contribute to giving a source authority, and that could include the review process, that could include the credentials of the author, the experience of the author, right? So students need to recognize that not all sources are created equal, right? Some sources are going to be considered more authoritative than others, but that context really influences authority. So context influences what is considered authoritative, or the level of authority that is needed. In certain situations, some sources are going to be considered more authoritative than others, right? And, a source that can be perfectly fine to use in one situation would not be considered appropriate or authoritative in another situation, right? So that's the first key concept, this idea that authority being constructed and contextual. The second is information creation as a process. Right, so this is the understanding, again, that there are many different types of information sources that are created through a range of different processes. They come in many different formats. The format is often guided by the creation process. So certain creation processes lead to certain types of certain information formats, right? And the format of the source is closely connected to, in many ways, the authority of the source, right? So the perceived value of the source, certain formats are going to be considered more authoritative than others. This can be a really challenging concept for students to grasp because especially, most of our students have grown up in an age where they find everything on the internet. Everything looks like a website to them. So the sort of subtle differences in format that many of us see who grew up in a print world and can still think of what a print journal looks like and what a print newspaper looks like, right? Those differences may not really be clear to students. And so they may not see and understand why this particular type of source is not appropriate in this situation because the format, those format differences just, they don't see them. Right? The third is information has value. So this is a recognition that information has many different types of value, right? When this was really first proposed as a concept, it was information is a commodity, if that helps you think about this as well, right? So because information has value, many different types of value, there are many legal and ethical guidelines around how information can or should be used and shared. And again, this can be a really challenging concept for students who have grown up in an era where it seems like all the information that they need is available online for free. So when students first encounter, for example, a paywall for a scholarly article, they may not know how to deal with that because they don't have this conception of why that source might be considered, a commodity, for example. Research is inquiry. So we already had a little bit of mention of this one, right? So this idea of research as this open-ended process that is driven by questions, right? Driven by problems. And that folks within and between disciplines are working on research in this kind of collaborative process to try to find answers to these questions or problems. But recognizing that those answers are likely going to lead to new questions. Research as inquiry is very closely tied into the idea of scholarship as conversation, right? So this understanding that the researchers, scholars, professionals within particular fields are always engaging in these ongoing conversations through their work, where they are debating and discussing new findings and ideas. And so thinking about sources as being a voice in this conversation. So that comes to this recognition that, hey, you can't just use one source because that source only recognizes one particular voice or one group of voices, for example. And also, it's really challenging sometimes for students to recognize that the conversation can change over time. So even if a scholarly consensus has developed, new voices can come in, new questions can be asked, new data can be found that can change that conversation over time. Okay. And then the last is this idea of searching as strategic exploration. So this idea that there are multiple search tools or multiple search strategies. You can't use the same search strategy or same search tool for every search. It has to be, it's dependent on context. Context is very key in all of these concepts, this recognition of, that the context is going to change the search process. It's going to change the sources. It's going to change, where you go to find information. All of that is really key. So those are the 6 sort of information literacy threshold concepts that have been identified by the Framework for Information Literacy. I did want to point out that there was a lot of discussion about within the field about what these concepts should be. Other concepts were proposed. The framework was not meant to be like the final word on here are the absolute threshold concepts that are within this field. It was meant to have a recognition that other people could propose other threshold concepts. I'll mention that I mentioned that Townsend and her colleagues did a lot of the work to develop this idea of threshold concepts. And a couple of years ago, they published a book on information literacy threshold concepts, and they actually ended up leaving scholarship as conversation out. So they had changed their mind by that point about whether or not scholarship as conversation was a threshold concept. So I think that just gives an idea of the fact that there's not going to be always uniform agreement about what constitutes a threshold concept. For me, scholarship as conversation has been one of the most transformative concepts. So it really could depend on your perspective, right? So I wanted to share with that. So as I mentioned, scholarship as conversation is one that I really like. So I thought we'd pause here to think more about this concept. So first of all, any questions that folks have on any of those 6 concepts, please go ahead and put those in the chat. And then I wanted to think a little bit about why scholarship as conversation might be considered a threshold concept. So if you have ideas about why you think that this might be really integrative, or what would students better understand? Once a student understands the idea of scholarship as conversation, what parts of the research process make more sense to them? What types of assignments would they be able to better understand? What expectations would they better understand once they get having a grasp of this concept? So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts that you all might have about scholarship as conversation as a threshold concept and how you see this as being transformative or changing the way students might approach certain types of assignments or expectations that they have. So I'll pause there. Could you share the Townsend citation, please? Yes, absolutely. So all the citations will be at the end. And they're at the end of the slideshow, and I'll share the links to the slideshow out with everyone at the end. So just pause here just to see if any folks have any ideas about thinking about scholarship as conversation as a threshold concept. So Juha shared searching sources and selecting pieces of information from sources to construct their own argument interpretation. Yeah, absolutely, right? So a key part of scholarship as conversation is the recognition that you are supposed to add your own voice into the conversation so that you're not just regurgitating what others said, you are analyzing and looking at the other arguments, the research done, you're pulling out pieces, you're integrating those, and then you are making your own argument. All right, absolutely. So other things that folks shared, right? Citations make sense as our scholarship doesn't exist in a vacuum, and showing how your work fits into that existing work can help you understand the material better. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the key things that I think that is really relevant with scholarship as a conversation, is a better understanding of why we are so insistent on citations, right? As experienced researchers, we recognize citations as the record of the conversation that has been taking place. Now, when we cite sources, we are telling people, here's the part of the conversation that I'm engaging in. I'm placing my work within this conversation, right? So that's a different way of approaching and thinking about why it's so important to think about citations. Absolutely, completely agree. Help students understand that no one person has the definitive answer, right? That they have to contribute to the conversation, right? That there's rarely one right answer. Yes. Rebecca shared it would help them understand the idea of finding a gap and making that the focus of their research writing. Most undergrads aren't producing writing that is original, right? But they would be expected to do that in graduate school. I completely agree, Rebecca. I remember a conversation that I had working with a graduate student was like, and trying to explain this concept of what you're looking for is what is not there, right? You're looking for the gap. What is the question that hasn't been asked yet? What is the answer that hasn't been found yet? And that's a different way of approaching research. And it can, that graduate students are expected to do. And it can be really challenging to make that. Yes, absolutely. The value of citation, range of sources, looking for a single definitive answer. Yeah. So got a lot of very similar responses here, right? This idea that it helps students understand why they need to use multiple sources, why they can't just go to one source, that they're expected to bring in multiple sources, that they're expected to add to the conversation, why they're expected to cite, right? Students become overly attached to their side and can cause them to ignore good arguments from the other side. Yes, absolutely, right? So yeah, so I think I love the responses that you all have here about why this is such an important conversation. Helpful way to approach fears about being wrong. Yes, because you're entering a conversation, you're making an argument, but you're recognizing that others are making arguments as well, and it's part of that conversation. And there are seminal works, and that is completely true as well, Kate. There are expectations that there are going to be certain sources that you need to be citing, be taken seriously as a scholar and a person talking on this topic. Absolutely. All right. So those were the threshold concepts that were developed by the ACRL librarian, so has that information literacy focus. I wanted to see if others had been talking about threshold concepts in relation to research outside of the library world. So I found some interesting research that Kylie had been doing, thinking about doctoral students and reaching out and talking to folks that advise doctoral students. What are the threshold concepts when it comes to research, thinking about doctoral students? And some of these I think are very similar to the framework concepts. Some are a little bit different. So I wanted to share these as some additional examples of threshold concepts when it comes to research. So one of the ones that Kylie puts forward as a threshold concept when it comes to research is this idea of argument or thesis. So this idea that a goal of your research is to make an argument, right? To make and sustain an argument, right? So this need for this overarching argument, right? That students were coming in and they would have their ideas, they would have their data, but they didn't know how to combine that into creating a sustained, defensible argument, right? So that was one concept that Kylie proposed, and I think that's that's similar to some of the concepts that we've talked about with the framework. Another is theory or model. So this idea that students really struggle with this idea of not understanding a particular theory, but using theory as part of their research. So either generating a theory from their research or applying a theory to their research or theorizing their research, right? And I think this is one I still struggle with, I think, a lot. So, that it's not just about sharing my data, it's about creating some sort of model or creating some sort of theory that can allow what I found to be applicable in other places to other scholars. So argument or theory, knowledge creation was another proposed by Kylie. And this, I think, is really closely aligned with the idea of scholarship as conversation, right? This idea that your role is to produce original research, to contribute original research, not just to report the research of others. Kylie also puts forward framework as an option. And so basically the idea of the framing or limiting your research, that there's some sort of framework, right, that locates your research, that it puts it in a particular, framing, puts it in a particular approach, that can be a real challenge for students as well. Analysis, and I don't think this one probably would be a surprise to a lot of folks, but right, that students may have they gather their data, they can describe what their data is, but are they actually analyzing their data, right? So it talks about, right, they might have their data collection strategies, but do they have an approach that they're using or strategy that they're using to actually analyze their data? And that can be a real challenge as well. And then the last one that Kylie proposes is this idea of research paradigm. So understanding that your particular discipline or field or your approach is, influenced by a particular worldview. And that is going to influence the types of questions that you ask, that is going to influence the methods that you use to address those particular questions, right? And so Kylie gives the example of basically of someone falling down the stairs. A lawyer is going to ask different questions if they see that than an architect would, and then maybe a medical professional would, right? So the initial questions that they will come up with is going to be based on the worldview that they have as a practitioner in that particular field, right? And so that worldview really influences how they approach and go about their work. Right. So I'd love to hear about, I know that some folks here were already familiar with the framework threshold concepts, but I'd love to hear in general your all's impressions in terms of any of these that we've identified as threshold concepts related to research or information literacy. Are there any of these that really resonate with you, that really, are maybe helping you to make sense of something? Any that you really consider valuable or like key, that we really need to talk about these with students? And if there's anything that you see that's not represented that you would consider to be a threshold concept, I would love to hear that as well. So I'll pause here really quickly, because I know we're already running out of time, but just to see if there are any thoughts that folks wanted to share really quickly on any of those. I know the work from Kylie, as I was looking at it, was completely new to me, and it was really helpful in thinking about comparing that to the framework concepts, which I was much more familiar with. So open it up really quickly to any questions or discussions. And if folks aren't ready to share at that time, that's totally okay as well. I know I just threw a lot of content at everyone. So it sometimes takes some time to kind of think through these things. So it's totally okay if you're not in a position where you feel prepared to share at this time. So Rebecca shared worldview research paradigms. The biggest benefit I gained from my PhD courses were those theories paradigms. Yes, thank you for sharing, Rebecca. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kate shared developing something new rather than confirming something already accepted. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a real difficult transition or challenge for students to make that mental shift. And this is what I'm meant to be doing here. Mm-hmm. All right. So in the interest of time, just wanted to really briefly talk a little bit about teaching with a threshold concept approach. So basically, that if we think about this is a shift, right? So instead of maybe teaching research students how to complete discrete research tasks, like here's how to search a database, here's how to identify a peer review, here's how to write a literature review, right? If we approach this from a threshold concept approach, what our goal is as instructors is to help students identify what those thresholds are and how and to cross them, right? So that is a different way of approaching and thinking about teaching research or information literacy. So we don't really have time to do this. I was going to ask you all to think about sort of the benefits and challenges of this approach, but I'll mention a few myself really quickly. So one of the challenges that I mentioned, we've already talked a little bit about this, is that, it can be difficult to identify what those thresholds are, because once you've made that transition, it's hard to see things from the perspective of a novice learner. And that's why it's been really helpful if folks within a discipline or field come together to start trying to identify what those threshold concepts are. And hopefully the examples that I've given you will be helpful in thinking about what they might be in terms of the way that you work with students. But yeah, it can be really, really challenging just to identify what those threshold concepts are because we've already passed the threshold. A couple of benefits from this approach, right? So we know that students are getting stuck. So this can be a way where we really think about where are those places that our students are getting stuck and allow us to explicitly start addressing some of those areas. And I think that this has the benefit of creating a more equitable learning environment. Because I think that some students on their own are going to be able to cross through those thresholds, but some students may not. Some students might just get stuck without a little bit of help on our part, right? So they may just feel that, oh, I'm not meant to be in this field, I'm not meant to be in this profession. But if we are explicitly talking about these things with students and making them clear, I think that does create a little bit more of an equitable learning environment. And as Townsend and as her colleagues argue, right, threshold concepts can help us to address the why questions. Like, why is it so important that I cite my sources? Why do I need to learn how to search a database? Why do I need to learn how to do a literature review? Right? Those questions that we get that can be difficult to answer, if we could approach it from a threshold concept approach, it can help us to start answering some of those questions. I did want to just mention clearly that some folks have raised concerns that, you know, this is a process of socialization. We're socializing students to think the same way that we do, and that there could be some concerns about that in terms of the power imbalances within, you know, higher education. So I'll put that out there. We don't really have time to talk about it, unfortunately, but if you're something that you're interested in thinking about, I think that's a really interesting quote to consider. And then I wanted to highlight really quickly just the strategy of decoding the disciplines. I know I've mentioned this before in other workshops, but decoding the disciplines works really well in tandem with threshold concepts. So this is a model for helping us to identify what we know and how we can explain that to students. So modeling, identifying those bottlenecks, and then modeling that for students. So if you're interested in learning about threshold concept, I've got a bunch of links to threshold concept or to decoding the disciplines. I've got a bunch of links available, but these really work really well together, right? Threshold concepts is about like identifying what those bottlenecks are, and then decoding the disciplines is the process that we can use to help students move beyond those bottlenecks. Okay. So last thing really quickly, I just have a bunch of resources that I wanted to share. Here are some resources on decoding the disciplines. And then for each of the information literacy threshold concepts, I've shared a bunch of resources here. And one thing I really wanted to highlight as I was looking at this, and if you can see the concepts that have been most important to me, right? Because they're the ones that have the most links. So authority is constructed and contextual. I've talked about this a lot. I've done work on this. I've shared about this. So I have a lot of resources. Information creation as a process, I've talked less about. It's been less relevant to me as a concept, right? Whereas scholarship as conversation, I have tons of resources on. So that was really helpful for me just in thinking about recognizing the concepts that have been most valuable to me in my work. All right, so we're at the end. We have lots of references. I will share out the links and everything with everyone. So we'll open it up for these last couple of minutes for any questions, comments, thoughts that folks have. Thank you, Margaret. Did a quick lit searching object. Health sciences is sometimes a bit tricky to adjust content for the communities I support. Threshold concepts aren't something we are born knowing. Yes. Julia shared, I think threshold concepts can be a great framework for me when I give the end of semester review to my first year composition students. Yes, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Terrific first year seminar for the undergrads. That would be really interesting. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you all.